Hi everybody. In this video we're going to add in one more layer of color variation to this piece. But we want to focus that on being just a little bit more large scale in this case, so that we got something just a bit more interesting to work with. So again, the main thing I was finding with a lot of this reference is that there were lots of different kind of colors going on here, and I think that was one of the things that made that kind of copper and that age just a little bit more interesting. Just lots of different layers of different kind of things built into the same surface. So we're going to add in just a fill layer here. This one I want to turn a little bit more green. We're going to be incorporating some green into this anyways, but this is one of the ones I want to start with. So again, let's just make sure that we're dealing with base color. We want to change this to a multiply, I think in this case. Could go a little bit more saturated, I think, with that green. We'll see how it turns out in the final version. We don't need to change height, we don't need to change roughness or metalness or normal. So in this case, this kind of metal is just probably a little bit too dark. We probably want it to be something more along this line. What I do want to do also is just lower the intensity of my underlying metal as well. I do want that to just be a little bit darker overall because the highlights that we're getting on this are just a little bit too strong. And that's working out still pretty darn well. And again, because everything's multiplies and highlights, all of them will still work and exist properly on the underlying surface. So having these all set up properly means I could change this to almost any other kind of color, almost any other kind of color, and it's still going to work out pretty darn well. But again, I do want that to still have some kind of reasonable color to it. So let's just bring that back up. So here, again, let's just make sure we turn on this green variant. And this would be our rough edges. Again, just naming these is very valuable when trying to work with this stuff. So this works pretty good, but we're going to just drop in a black mask. Now, instead of using a generator in this case, because I just want big, large-scale variation here, I just want to focus on some simple stuff here. So grunge, we can start looking through these various different pieces of grunge. So, for example, we can look at these kind of big splatters or any of these other kinds of elements to find the one that's going to work really, really well for us. Now, one that I like is this grunge 14. Now, you can see here there's almost kind of stains and sort of hard surface edges. A lot of what I'm seeing in here looks very, very similar to what you'd see going on in some of the stains you see on copper kettles and things like that. So again, that's actually where I want to start. So let's just drop this into a fill layer on our green variant layer. So let's just drop this in. And let's start making sure that this is actually going to do what we want. So this does need quite a bit more contrast. Probably needs to show up a little bit different than we've got it showing up in here right now. So let's kind of go in that area here with this. Now we could also repeat this maybe twice on the model. In this case, let's use triplanar projection. Now, depending on how you want that to work, you could get some really good results from this. One thing we have to be aware of is by having all of these other meshes here, a triplanar projection does get a little bit confused because the orientations are all a little bit different. So just be aware of that when you dive into this. UV projection, can certainly work well in a lot of instances. You just got to watch out for directional types of details. These are not very directional, so we're just fine. So again, I just want to make sure that we kind of pull this up, even lower the contrast there just a little bit. And we start to get something that's relatively interesting, but I think I need to increase the scale a little bit more here so that we get some stains, but you want them to look pretty convincing. So again, let's just randomize this a little bit more again. See if we get something that's going to be a little bit more interesting. Could move that light around. Let's check this side too. Some of them are not quite working out the way that I want. Let's just jump in here again, see how the intensity is looking. Our grunge could be a little bit higher contrast. You can see it show up here, and it's pretty good. But if we just bring that scale down a little bit more, and maybe even turn up, there we go, some of that intensity there. So you really kind of see that variation show up quite a bit more here. There we go. So you can certainly see this showing up on this surface. That really affects the way that metalness renders. And it starts to look pretty stained and distorted. That's actually pretty good in our case. There we go. So that's working out pretty decently for us. We're getting some interesting variation here. We could, of course, intensify that or just adjust however we want. In fact, in this case, I could go with an overlay as the blend mode instead, which will give us a little bit more color. Could desaturate that just a little bit and maybe even in some cases kind of brighten it up. There's no reason it needs to be a dark kind of material. It's sometimes kind of nice to just give it just a little bit more color variation so that you can see how this starts to look from afar. Just a little bit more color to it. Again, if we want to lower that just a bit more, we'll get some interesting effects out of it. So that's pretty compelling. Looks nice on this surface. It's not too noticeable or too bold. So maybe there's one more kind of thing we want to add to this. And that would be something that kind of pops certain details like these bolts just a bit more than we had before. Again, one more layer. Let's call this bolts. And let's just make this a bit darker and a bit more rough. No height, no metal, no normal on this again, but quite a bit more rough in this case. We'll set this to a multiply as well, but lower the intensity of that multiply. That works out pretty decently. Now, what we do want to do is add a black mask, and we do want to toss in a paint layer. So this paint layer means that we're going to be able to paint that kind of material onto this surface as much as we want. Now, in this case, we do want to set up just a few things. I want to increase the hardness, so that's Control right click and drag upwards to increase the hardness here. Let's just open up our brush settings. I want to turn no pressure sensitivity and no flow setting change on. So basically, there's just no change here. If I click, I get a simple circle. And all I need to do is just click on every single one of these bolts and just be as close as possible to the shape here. That works out pretty decent. Some of these bolts, remember, are overlapping UVs, so we'll already get them painted when we paint certain spots. There we go. This side, this piece. So just make sure you get the whole thing. Perfect. Just move the light source over here. And basically the reason that we're going to do this, let's just open that up a little bit more, is so that we get a little bit more of a large scale kind of change on this surface. These bolts are blending in just a little bit too much with everything else, and they start to not look particularly interesting or stand out-ish on that whole surface, which is not really what we want. Oh, let's pull that down a little bit, increase that hardness, and just go a little bit bigger here. There we go. And just paint that all into each and every bolt. The details might have not been set out in the first place, but there's no reason why we can't do it ourselves after the fact. Just do it on all of these bolts so that we get something that's a little bit more interesting. There we go. Pull that up. And we can repeat that process on this side for any parts that are not getting it right now. Works out pretty good. All right. So now you can see those details show up pretty decent. I could certainly darken them a bit more so that they read a little bit better from afar. And I could certainly brighten up my metal in my base color as well to kind of make sure that that reads a little bit better. I want to go with maybe just a little bit more of a rich kind of red tone here. That'll start to work out well. And we can again just continue adjusting these values so that these surfaces read on top of each other really, really nicely. So that works out pretty well. The last thing that we're going to want to start doing is doing the oxidization on this surface so that we're going to start getting a little bit more of that kind of grunge buildup and that little bit of bright green showing up on our texture.